A seemingly ordinary Tuesday morning at Naval Base Coronado, where the most elite warriors in the world go about their rigorous training routines. The sun barely crests the horizon as Navy SEALs emerge from another grueling night of exercises. Their bodies pushed to limits most people can't even imagine. But on this particular morning, something extraordinary was about to unfold in the most unexpected way possible. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Her name was Maria Thompson, though everyone at the base simply called her Thompson, or sometimes, less kindly, Butterfingers. At first glance, Maria appeared to be everything a Navy SEAL was not. Where SEALs moved with precision and deadly grace, Maria seemed to stumble over her own shadow. Where SEALs commanded respect through their mere presence, Maria blended into the background like wallpaper, invisible to most who passed her in the corridors, standing at an unremarkable 5'5" with a slight build that suggested she'd never seen the inside of a gym. Maria wore the standard-issue maintenance coveralls that hung loosely on her frame. Her mousy brown hair was perpetually pulled back in a messy ponytail, and thick-rimmed glasses sat precariously on her nose, constantly threatening to slide off whenever she bent over her work. To the casual observer, she was just another civilian contractor, one of dozens who kept the base running behind the scenes while the real warriors prepared for missions that would never make the evening news. But appearances, as this story will reveal, can be devastatingly deceiving. Maria had been working at Naval Base Coronado for exactly 18 months, 3 weeks, and 2 days, not that anyone was counting, least of all the SEALs who barely acknowledged her existence. Her job was simple enough: maintain the training facilities, fix broken equipment, ensure the lights stayed on and the water kept flowing. It was honest work, the kind that kept America's most elite fighting force operational, even if nobody really noticed the woman doing it. Every morning, at precisely 0600 hours, Maria would clock in at the maintenance office, a cramped space filled with spare parts, tools, and work orders that seemed to multiply overnight. She'd review her assignments for the day, load up her cart with the necessary equipment, and set off to tackle whatever mechanical ailments had developed since her last shift. More often than not, this routine was punctuated by minor disasters that had earned her that unfortunate nickname. There was the time she accidentally flooded the East Wing barracks while trying to fix a leaky pipe, sending 24 SEALs scrambling for higher ground in their underwear. Then there was the infamous incident with the electrical panel that plunged half the base into darkness during a critical night training exercise, forcing instructors to use flashlights and emergency lighting to continue their drills. Most recently, she'd somehow managed to lock herself inside a supply closet for 3 hours, requiring a maintenance crew to remove the door hinges to free her. Each mishap was met with eye rolls, frustrated sighs, and the kind of barely concealed irritation that suggested Maria's days at the base were numbered. Senior Chief Petty Officer Rodriguez, who oversaw civilian contractors, had already begun the paperwork to have Maria transferred to a less critical facility, somewhere her particular brand of chaos wouldn't interfere with the serious business of training America's most elite warriors. But Maria Thompson harbored secrets that ran deeper than ocean trenches, secrets that would soon transform her from the base's most overlooked figure into its most respected. Beneath those ill-fitting coveralls and behind those thick glasses lived experiences that would make even the most hardened SEAL pause in recognition and respect. The transformation began on what should have been just another routine Tuesday. Maria had been assigned to repair a malfunctioning ventilation system in Building C, home to some of the most advanced tactical training simulators on the West Coast. It was delicate work, requiring her to crawl through narrow spaces and navigate around sensitive electronic equipment that cost more than most people's houses. As she maneuvered through the cramped maintenance crawlway, her coveralls caught on a protruding bolt, tearing a significant hole in the fabric near her left shoulder blade. It was the kind of minor wardrobe malfunction that would normally send Maria scrambling to find a safety pin or duct tape to maintain her modesty. But on this particular morning, with deadlines pressing and work orders piling up, she decided to soldier on with the repair, unaware that this small tear in fabric would soon expose something that would change everything. The ventilation system proved more stubborn than usual, requiring Maria to contort herself into increasingly awkward positions as she traced the source of the malfunction. Sweat beaded on her forehead as she worked, the confined space making every movement a challenge. Finally, after nearly 2 hours of troubleshooting, she located the problem, a seized motor that would need to be completely replaced. As Maria emerged from the crawlway, her torn coveralls hanging loose and her face flushed from exertion, she found herself face to face with Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, one of the base's most decorated SEAL officers. Morrison was leading a group of fresh recruits through the building, explaining the various training systems and their importance to modern warfare. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was the kind of man who commanded attention simply by existing. 6'2" with shoulders that could block out the sun, he carried himself with the quiet confidence that came from surviving missions in places that didn't officially exist on any map. His steel-gray eyes had seen things that would break lesser men, and his weathered face told stories of battles fought in shadows, victories claimed in silence, and brothers lost to causes greater than themselves. As Morrison's gaze fell upon the disheveled maintenance worker emerging from the crawlway, his expression shifted from mild annoyance to something far more complex. The recruits behind him, still wet behind the ears and full of bravado, began to snicker at the sight of Maria struggling with her torn coveralls, sweat staining her shirt and her glasses hanging askew. "Looks like Butterfingers strikes again," whispered Seaman Richards, a cocky kid from Texas who thought he knew everything about warfare from playing video games and watching action movies. His comment drew chuckles from several other recruits, young men who had yet to learn that true strength often wore the most unexpected disguises. But Morrison raised his hand sharply, silencing the group with a gesture that brooked no argument. His eyes had locked onto something that made his blood run cold and his heart race with a mixture of disbelief and profound respect. Through the tear in Maria's coveralls, barely visible against her pale skin, was the edge of a tattoo that Morrison recognized immediately. It wasn't the tattoo itself that stopped Morrison in his tracks. The base was full of inked warriors sporting everything from unit insignias to personal mantras. It was the specific design, the particular combination of symbols and text that only a very select group of individuals had the right to wear. Morrison had seen this exact tattoo only a handful of times in his 15-year career, and each time, it had been on the skin of someone who had achieved something extraordinary, something that placed them in the uppermost echelons of military elite. "Recruits dismissed. Return to barracks and review today's materials," Morrison commanded, his voice carrying an authority that sent the young SEALs scurrying without question. They exchanged confused glances as they filed out, wondering what had caused their normally unflappable commander to suddenly change course. Once alone with Maria, Morrison approached slowly, his demeanor shifting from commanding officer to something approaching reverence. Maria, meanwhile, had become aware of the tear in her coveralls and was attempting to gather the fabric together, completely unaware of what she had inadvertently revealed. "Thompson," Morrison said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "That tattoo on your shoulder blade. Mind if I ask where you got it?" Maria froze, her hand still clutching at the torn fabric. The question had been asked casually enough, but there was something in Morrison's tone that suggested this wasn't idle curiosity. For a moment, the maintenance worker's entire demeanor seemed to shift, as if an invisible mask had been partially removed, revealing glimpses of something far more substantial beneath. "It's nothing special," Maria replied, her voice steady but her eyes betraying a depth that hadn't been there moments before. Just some old ink from a different time. Morrison studied the woman before him with new eyes. The slightly stooped posture, the thick glasses, the general air of incompetence, suddenly it all seemed less like natural clumsiness and more like carefully constructed camouflage. How many times had Morrison himself witnessed operators who could blend seamlessly into any environment, becoming invisible through the simple act of appearing unremarkable? "That's not just any ink, and we both know it," Morrison said, stepping closer. "That's a unit tattoo. Specifically, it's the kind of tattoo that only gets applied in a very particular place, after completing a very particular set of qualifications." The silence that followed stretched between them like a taut wire. Maria's hand moved unconsciously to cover the exposed portion of the tattoo, but the damage was done. Morrison had seen enough to confirm his suspicions, and there was no putting that particular genie back in its bottle. "I think you might be mistaken, sir," Maria said carefully, her voice carrying the slightest hint of an accent that Morrison couldn't quite place. "I'm just maintenance, always have been." But Morrison wasn't buying it. His trained eye had caught other details now that he was looking properly. The way Maria stood when she thought no one was watching, not the hunched posture of a perpetual victim, but the balanced stance of someone ready to move in any direction at a moment's notice. The calluses on her hands weren't just from wielding wrenches and screwdrivers. There were other marks, the kind that came from handling very different kinds of tools entirely. "The thing about unit tattoos," Morrison continued, his voice taking on the tone of someone sharing classified information, "is that they're not just decorative. They're earned through blood, sweat, and circumstances that most people couldn't survive, let alone excel in. The particular design I glimpsed on your shoulder, that represents service in places that don't exist on official maps, with people whose names never appear in history books." Maria remained silent, but Morrison noticed that her breathing had changed, becoming more controlled, more measured. It was the kind of breathing pattern taught in advanced combat training, designed to maintain optimal performance under extreme stress. "You know what I think, Thompson?" Morrison asked, though it was clear he wasn't really seeking an answer. "I think you've been hiding in plain sight, playing the part of the bumbling maintenance worker so well that nobody bothers to look twice at you. But that tattoo tells a different story entirely." The maintenance bay fell into a silence so complete that the distant sound of SEAL training exercises seemed to echo from another world entirely. Maria Thompson stood frozen in that torn coverall, one hand still attempting to conceal the tattoo that had betrayed 18 months of carefully constructed anonymity. Lieutenant Commander Morrison watched her with the patient intensity of a predator who had just discovered that his prey was far more dangerous than initially assumed. "I've been in the teams for 15 years, Morrison said finally, his voice carrying the weight of hard-earned experience. "I've worked alongside operators from every branch, every specialty unit, every shadow organization that officially doesn't exist. I know the difference between earned ink and pretender ink. What you're hiding under there isn't something you pick up at the local tattoo parlor during a weekend liberty." Maria's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, a micro-expression that would have been invisible to anyone without Morrison's level of training. But the SEAL commander caught it, adding another piece to the puzzle that was rapidly forming in his mind. The tattoo in question was still only partially visible through the tear in the coverall, but Morrison had seen enough. A stylized eagle, wings spread in a specific configuration, clutching lightning bolts in its talons, while perched atop a shield bearing coordinates that corresponded to no publicly acknowledged military installation. Beneath the eagle, barely visible, were numbers that represented something far more significant than a service number or rank designation. "You want to know what gave you away?" Morrison asked, stepping closer. It wasn't just the tattoo, though. That was the final confirmation. It was the way you've been moving around this base for 18 months. See, everyone thinks you're clumsy, but I've been watching. Really watching. You never actually hurt yourself during those accidents. The flooded barracks. You were 3 steps clear of the water before it even started flowing. The electrical incident. You were wearing rubber-soled boots and standing on a dry mat when that panel shorted out. Every single mishap you've had has resulted in disruption, confusion, and chaos, but never any real harm to you or anyone else. Maria's eyes flickered with something that might have been surprise, or perhaps approval. For the first time since the conversation began, she seemed to relax slightly, as if the effort of maintaining her cover was becoming too exhausting to sustain. What's more, Morrison continued, I've been reviewing security footage from the past year. You know what I found? Every time there's been a security drill, a snap inspection, or an unannounced visit from higher command, one of your accidents happens within hours, creating just enough disruption to mask movement patterns, obscure sightlines, or provide convenient excuses for people to be in places they wouldn't normally have access to. The accusation hung in the air between them, not quite voiced but clearly implied. Maria Thompson wasn't just a clumsy maintenance worker. She was something far more sophisticated. Someone whose presence at Naval Base Coronado served purposes that extended well beyond fixing broken pipes and malfunctioning ventilation systems. I think, Morrison said slowly, that you've been conducting surveillance. Long-term, deep-cover surveillance of one of America's most classified training facilities. The question is, are you working for us or against us? For a long moment, Maria said nothing. Her hands moved to fully zip up her coverall, concealing the tattoo once again, but the damage was done. The careful facade she had maintained for over a year had crumbled in the space of a few minutes, undone by a torn piece of fabric and the sharp eyes of a man who had made a career of seeing through deception. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was different. Gone was the slightly nasal, hesitant tone of the bumbling maintenance worker. In its place was something harder, more confident, carrying traces of authority that suggested this woman was accustomed to being obeyed rather than overlooked. Lieutenant. Commander Morrison, Maria said, meeting the SEAL's gaze directly for the first time. I think this conversation has gone far enough. If you have concerns about my security clearance or my presence on this base, I suggest you contact your commanding officer. I'm sure Colonel Martinez can clarify any questions you might have about my assignment here. Morrison's eyes narrowed. Colonel Martinez was the base commander, a man who operated at levels of classification that even senior SEAL officers weren't always privy to. The fact that this supposedly civilian contractor was dropping the colonel's name with such casual confidence suggested that Maria Thompson's rabbit hole went much deeper than anyone had imagined. You're not just maintenance, Morrison stated. It wasn't a question. I maintain things, Maria replied, and there was something almost playful in her tone now, as if she was enjoying the verbal sparring. Just not always the kind of things that show up on work orders. Before Morrison could respond, Maria had gathered her tools and was walking toward the exit. But she paused at the doorway, turning back with an expression that was completely unlike anything the base had seen from there. Supposedly incompetent maintenance worker. Commander, Maria said, her voice carrying a weight of experience that made Morrison instinctively straighten. That tattoo you saw? It represents service in places where the wrong move doesn't just mean mission failure, it means people die. Good people. People with families and dreams and futures that depend on operators who can blend in anywhere, become anyone, and complete objectives that can never be officially acknowledged. She adjusted her glasses, but now the gesture seemed less like nervous habit and more like someone ensuring optimal visual clarity for whatever might come next. Sometimes the most important battles are fought by people no one ever notices. Sometimes the greatest victories are won by individuals whose names will never appear in history books. And sometimes the most dangerous operators are the ones everyone assumes are harmless. With that, Maria Thompson walked out of the maintenance bay, leaving Lieutenant Commander Morrison alone with the sudden, unsettling realization that everything he thought he knew about their clumsy contractor had just been turned completely upside down. Lieutenant Commander Morrison stood alone in the maintenance bay for several minutes after Maria had departed, his mind racing to process what had just occurred. In 15 years of military service, including deployments to some of the world's most dangerous hotspots, he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read people. But Maria Thompson, if that was even her real name, had just demonstrated a level of operational sophistication that rivaled anything Morrison had encountered in his career. The implications were staggering. If Maria was indeed who Morrison suspected she might be, then Naval Base Coronado had been hosting one of the military's most elite operators for over a year without anyone being the wiser. But that raised even more disturbing questions. What kind of operation required such deep long-term cover? What was so important that it justified placing an operator of this caliber in the role of a bumbling maintenance worker? Morrison pulled out his secure phone and hesitated. Protocol dictated that he should immediately report this incident to his superiors, but something held him back. Maria had mentioned Colonel Martinez by name, suggesting that this situation operated at levels far above Morrison's pay grade. If he was wrong about Maria, he'd look like a paranoid fool. If he was right, he might be interfering with an operation so classified that even questioning it could end his career. Instead, Morrison decided to conduct his own investigation. He had access to enough databases and surveillance systems to dig deeper into Maria Thompson's background, and his instincts told him that what he found would be far more interesting than a simple maintenance worker's personnel file. Meanwhile, Maria had returned to her cramped maintenance office, but her demeanor had undergone a complete transformation. Gone was the hunched posture and nervous energy that had characterized her movements for the past 18 months. She moved with the fluid precision of someone whose every action was calculated, deliberate, and purposeful. Sitting at her cluttered desk, Maria opened what appeared to be a standard maintenance log, but her fingers found a hidden compartment beneath the surface. Inside was a piece of equipment that definitely wasn't standard issue for civilian contractors, a military-grade encrypted satellite phone, the kind used for communications that needed to remain invisible to traditional monitoring systems. Dialed a number from memory, and the phone was answered on the first ring. "Control," came a voice that betrayed no gender, age, or regional accent. "Blackbird," Maria replied, using her operational call sign for the first time in months. "We have a problem." "Specify." "Cover's been compromised." SEAL commander made my ink during a routine encounter. Containment may no longer be viable. There was a pause that lasted exactly 3 seconds, long enough for the person on the other end to process the information and consult whatever resources they had available. Assessment of compromise level? Maria considered the question carefully. Subject demonstrated advanced observational skills and tactical awareness. Cross-referenced my operational patterns with base activities. Likely to pursue further investigation regardless of deterrent efforts. Recommendations? 2 options, Maria replied, her voice taking on the clinical tone of someone accustomed to making life and death decisions. Full extraction and mission. Abort or controlled revelation with potential asset recruitment. Another pause, this one longer. Elaborate on option 2. Subject is Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison, 15-year veteran, decorated combat record, security clearance level. Sufficient for partial briefing. Psychology profile suggests loyalty to mission over protocol. Could be valuable for Phase 3 operations. Negative. Mission parameters require continued invisibility. Prepare for extraction. Maria felt a familiar pang of disappointment. After 18 months of careful positioning, her mission at Naval Base Coronado was about to end just as it was reaching its most critical phase. But orders were orders, and questioning them wasn't part of her programming. Understood. Timeline for extraction? 72 hours. Maintain cover until retrieval team arrives. Any further compromise triggers immediate abort protocols. The line went dead, leaving Maria alone with the weight of an operation that was about to disappear like smoke, taking with it months of careful intelligence gathering and relationship building. But as she returned the encrypted phone to its hiding place, her mind was already working on contingencies. Maria Thompson had survived in the shadow world by never fully relying on any single plan, and this situation would be no different across the base. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was discovering that Maria Thompson's personnel file raised more questions than it answered. According to official records, Maria had been born in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, attended community college for 2 years before dropping out, and had worked a series of unremarkable jobs before applying for her position at Naval Base Coronado. Her background check had come back clean, her references had checked out, and her work history showed exactly the kind of mediocre performance one would expect from someone of her apparent capabilities. But Morrison's instincts were screaming that something was wrong. The file was too clean, too perfect in its mundane details. Real people had inconsistencies, gaps in employment, minor legal troubles, or personal complications that showed up in background investigations. Maria Thompson's file read like it had been constructed by committee, designed to pass casual scrutiny while revealing absolutely nothing of substance about the woman it purported to describe. Morrison accessed the base's security camera system and began reviewing footage from the past several months, focusing specifically on Maria's movements and behaviors. What he found confirmed his suspicions and added new layers to the mystery. When Maria thought no one was watching, her entire physical presentation changed. The slouched shoulders straightened, the hesitant gait became purposeful, and the thick glasses were periodically removed and cleaned with the kind of methodical precision that suggested they might not be entirely necessary for vision correction. More tellingly, Morrison discovered that Maria had managed to gain access to areas of the base that should have been impossible for someone with her security clearance. Maintenance requests that took her near classified training areas, equipment failures that required her to enter secure facilities, and accidental wrong turns that led her through sections of the base that most personnel never saw in their entire careers. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What Morrison discovered next made his blood run cold with a mixture of professional admiration and growing concern. Using advanced playback software, he isolated Maria's movements during a particularly chaotic day 6 months earlier, when a surprise inspection by Pentagon officials had thrown the entire base into controlled pandemonium. While everyone else had been scrambling to prepare for the inspection, Maria had been conducting what appeared to be routine maintenance on the ventilation system in Building D, the same building where classified briefings were held for incoming SEAL teams. But Morrison's enhanced analysis revealed something extraordinary. Maria hadn't been fixing the ventilation system at all. She had been installing something. The equipment was so sophisticated and so well concealed that it had taken Morrison nearly an hour of frame-by-frame analysis to spot it. Tucked into the ductwork, invisible to casual inspection, was what appeared to be an advanced listening device, military grade, the kind of surveillance equipment that wasn't available to civilian contractors or even most military personnel. Morrison's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his secure phone. This was no longer a matter of curiosity or professional suspicion. If Maria Thompson was conducting surveillance operations against U.S. military facilities, then Naval Base Coronado was dealing with either the most sophisticated counterintelligence Operation in recent memory, or they had been infiltrated by a hostile agent operating at levels that suggested state-sponsored espionage. But before he could dial, Morrison's training kicked in with a sobering realization. If Maria was a hostile agent, then alerting the chain of command through normal channels could compromise any ongoing investigation. If Maria was working for U.S. intelligence, then Morrison's interference could destroy an operation of vital national importance. Either way, a wrong move at this point could have catastrophic consequences. Instead, Morrison decided to confront Maria directly, but this time with backup and in a controlled environment. He gathered two of his most trusted team members, Master Chief Rodriguez and Petty Officer First Class Chun, and briefed them on the situation without revealing the full extent of his suspicions. "We're going to have a conversation with our maintenance contractor," Morrison told them. "I need you both there as witnesses, but unless I give a direct signal, you stay quiet and observe. Something tells me we're about to discover that Maria Thompson is far more than she appears to be." The three SEALs made their way to the maintenance office, where they found Maria exactly where Morrison expected, hunched over her desk, apparently reviewing work orders for the following day. But Morrison noticed details he had missed before: the way Maria's peripheral vision tracked their approach, the subtle shift in her posture that suggested readiness rather than surprise, and the fact that her hands never moved more than 6 inches from what Morrison now suspected might be a concealed weapon. "Thompson," Morrison said, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed, "we need to talk." Maria looked up with the same mild, slightly confused expression she had worn for 18 months. But Morrison caught the micro-expression that flashed across her features for less than 1/10 of a second, a look of calculation and assessment that belonged on the face of an experienced operator, not a bumbling maintenance worker. "Of course, Commander," Maria replied, her voice carrying just the right note of nervous respect. "Is there a problem with one of my repairs?" "You could say that," Morrison replied, pulling up a chair and sitting down across from Maria while Rodriguez and Chun positioned themselves strategically near the exit. "See, I've been reviewing some security footage, and I've discovered some interesting inconsistencies in your work patterns." Maria's hands stilled on the desk, and Morrison noticed that her breathing had shifted to the controlled rhythm of someone preparing for potential combat. It was a subtle change, but unmistakable to someone with Morrison's level of training. "What kind of inconsistencies?" Maria asked, and Morrison detected the slightest hardening in her tone. "The kind that suggest you've been conducting surveillance operations against a classified military installation," Morrison replied bluntly. "The kind that indicate you've been using your maintenance access to plant listening devices in secure areas. The kind that make me wonder whether Maria Thompson is your real name, or just the latest in a series of carefully constructed identities." Silence that followed stretched for nearly 30 seconds, during which Morrison watched Maria's demeanor undergo another transformation. The nervous maintenance worker disappeared entirely, replaced by someone whose presence suddenly filled the small office with an almost palpable sense of danger. When Maria finally spoke, her voice was completely different, harder, more confident, carrying an accent that Morrison couldn't quite place but suggested extensive international experience. "Lieutenant Commander Morrison," Maria said, leaning back in her chair with the casual confidence of someone who had just decided to stop pretending. "You've been very thorough in your investigation. Almost professionally thorough, one might say." Rodriguez and Chun exchanged glances, both men sensing that the dynamic in the room had shifted dramatically. The person sitting behind the desk was no longer the harmless contractor they thought they knew, but someone whose very presence suggested capabilities that exceeded their own. "The question now," Maria continued, "is what you plan to do with that information. Because I should point out that your investigation, while impressive, has crossed several boundaries that could be considered problematic for someone with your security clearance level." Morrison felt a chill run down his spine. There was something in Maria's tone that suggested this conversation was moving into territory where careers ended and people disappeared into bureaucratic black holes from which they never emerged. "Are you threatening a United States Navy officer?" Morrison asked, his hand moving instinctively toward his sidearm. Maria noticed the movement and smiled, an expression that contained no warmth whatsoever. "Threatening? No, Commander. I'm simply pointing out that we've reached a point where all of our cards need to be on the table. Because the truth is, you've stumbled into something much larger and much more important than you realize." Maria stood up slowly, her movements fluid and controlled in a way that made Rodriguez and Chun unconsciously shift into defensive positions. But instead of reaching for a weapon or making any aggressive move, Maria walked to a seemingly innocent filing cabinet and opened the bottom drawer. From within, she withdrew a leather folder that looked far too official to belong to a civilian maintenance contractor. She placed it on the desk between herself and Morrison, then stepped back with her hands visible, a gesture that somehow managed to be both non-threatening and deeply ominous. "Open it," Maria said simply. Morrison hesitated for a moment, then reached for the folder. Inside, he found documentation that made his blood run cold, and his understanding of the situation flipped completely upside down. The first page bore the seal of the Department of Defense, and was classified at levels that Morrison had never even heard of. But it was the signature at the bottom that made his hands tremble. General Patricia Hayes, Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The document was brief but devastating in its implications. Maria Thompson, though that was indeed not her real name, was operating under the direct authority of the highest levels of military command. Her mission at Naval Base Coronado was not surveillance in the traditional sense, but something far more complex and infinitely more important. "You're not spying on us," Morrison said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You're protecting us." Maria nodded slowly. "For the past 18 months, I've been conducting a comprehensive security assessment of this facility. Every accident I've caused, every system I've accidentally disrupted, every area I've mistakenly accessed, all of it has been part of the most thorough penetration test ever conducted on a U.S. military installation." Rodriguez stepped forward, his face flushed with anger. "You mean to tell us you've been playing us for fools for over a year?" "I've been identifying weaknesses," Maria replied, her tone patient but firm. "Weaknesses that could be exploited by actual hostile agents. Do you have any idea how many security protocols I've been able to bypass? How many classified areas I've accessed without proper authorization? How many pieces of sensitive equipment I've been able to compromise without anyone noticing?" Morrison was reading through the documentation, and each page revealed new layers of the operation. Maria wasn't just any operator, she was part of a specialized unit that conducted deep cover security assessments of the military's most sensitive installations. Her background included training with CIA, NSA, and several organizations that Morrison had never heard of but whose description suggested capabilities that bordered on science fiction. "The tattoo," Morrison said suddenly. "That's not from a combat unit. That's from something else entirely," Maria nodded. "Psychological Operations Command. Special Access Programs Division. We're the people who test whether America's most secure facilities are actually secure. And I'm sorry to say, Commander, but Naval Base Coronado has failed that test spectacularly." She gestured toward the filing cabinet, which Morrison now realized contained far more than maintenance records. "I have documented evidence of 47 separate security vulnerabilities, 23 instances of protocol violations that went unnoticed by command staff, and 12 separate occasions where I was able to access classified information that could compromise ongoing operations if it fell into the wrong hands." Chun looked like someone had just told him that gravity was optional. "But you're so clumsy. You flood barracks, you lock yourself in closets. You I create controlled chaos that masks movement patterns and provides cover for access operations. Maria interrupted. Every single accident I've had served a specific purpose in mapping this facility's security responses and identifying gaps in your defensive protocols. Morrison closed the folder and looked at Maria with new eyes. The woman standing before him wasn't the bumbling contractor they had all dismissed, but one of the military's most elite operators, someone whose skills were so advanced that she could maintain deep cover for over a year while conducting the most sophisticated security assessment in naval history. "Why reveal yourself now?" Morrison asked. "Why blow your cover after all this time?" Maria's expression grew serious. "Because my assessment is complete, and the results are going to require immediate and comprehensive changes to how this base operates. But more importantly, because the intelligence I've gathered suggests that Coronado isn't just vulnerable, it's actively being targeted." The room fell silent as the implications of that statement sank in. Morrison felt pieces of a larger puzzle clicking into place, connections forming between incidents and patterns that he had previously dismissed as coincidence. Targeted by whom? Rodriguez asked. Maria returned to her desk and pulled out a thick file that was marked with classifications Morrison had never seen before. 3 months ago, my surveillance equipment detected attempts to penetrate base communication systems. 2 months ago, I identified what appeared to be reconnaissance activities by individuals with no legitimate reason to be in the area. Last month, I intercepted communications suggesting that a hostile intelligence service has been conducting their own assessment of this facility. She spread photographs across the desk, surveillance images of people near the base perimeter, technical diagrams of communication systems, and intercepts of coded transmissions that looked like they belonged in a spy thriller. The reason I maintained my cover for so long wasn't just to test your security. It was to identify and track a genuine espionage operation that has been developing around this base for the better part of a year. And based on my analysis, they're getting ready to make their move. Morrison stared at the evidence spread before him, realizing that what he had thought was a simple case of mistaken identity had actually been his introduction to an operation that could determine the security of one of America's most critical military installations. The photograph showed faces he didn't recognize, but positions and equipment that suggested a level of sophistication that went far beyond casual espionage. "How long have you known about this threat?" Morrison asked, his voice tight with controlled anger at the realization that his base, his SEALs, had been operating under potential surveillance for months. Maria began organizing the photographs into chronological order, creating a timeline that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The first indicators appeared approximately 14 weeks ago. Initially, it looked like routine intelligence gathering, the kind of low-level reconnaissance that every major military installation experiences. But the pattern evolved rapidly, becoming more focused, more aggressive, and significantly more technically sophisticated. She pointed to a series of images that showed the same individual at different locations around the base perimeter, always with different equipment, always with perfect sightlines to critical infrastructure. This woman appeared 17 times over a 6-week period. She used 7 different cover identities: jogger, birdwatcher, real estate agent, environmental surveyor, freelance photographer, graduate student, and local historian. Each identity was supported by documentation that would pass casual scrutiny, but when examined closely, they all traced back to shell companies and fabricated backgrounds. Rodriguez leaned over the desk, studying the photographs with the trained eye of someone who had spent years identifying threats in hostile environments. Professional-grade tradecraft. This wasn't some amateur operation. "Correct," Maria replied. "But she was just the surveillance element. The real concern is what came next." She spread out a series of technical diagrams that looked like they had been drawn by someone with intimate knowledge of the base's communication systems. power grid, and security infrastructure. These were intercepted from a dead drop location approximately 2 miles from the main gate. The level of detail is extraordinarily accurate down to individual circuit breakers, backup generators, and emergency protocols that aren't documented in any publicly available sources. Morrison felt his stomach drop as he recognized systems and locations that were classified at levels requiring special access clearances. Someone with inside knowledge provided this information. "That's what I thought initially," Maria said, her tone growing darker. "But my investigation revealed something more disturbing. This intelligence wasn't gathered by a human asset inside the base. It was compiled through a systematic campaign of electronic surveillance, social engineering, and technical penetration that took place over several months." She pulled out another file, this one containing printouts of intercepted communications that had been decoded and translated from what appeared to be multiple languages. "The operation is being run by a joint task force representing at least 3 different intelligence services. The primary coordination appears to be Chinese MSS, but there are clear indicators of Russian SVR involvement and what looks like Iranian Quds Force technical support." Shun whistled low under his breath. "A multinational espionage operation targeting Coronado specifically. What's the objective?" Maria's expression grew even more serious. "That's where things get complicated. Based on the intelligence patterns and the specific systems they're targeting, this isn't a simple information gathering operation. They're not just trying to learn about SEAL training methods or operational capabilities." She spread out a map of the base with various locations marked in different colors, creating a pattern that took Morrison several seconds to recognize. "They're planning a direct action operation. Sabotage, assassination, or extraction, possibly all 3 simultaneously. The surveillance pattern, the technical intelligence gathering, the timing of their activities, it all points to preparation for a physical assault on this facility." The room fell silent as the full implications of Maria's revelation sank in. Naval Base Coronado wasn't just being watched. It was being prepared for attack by a sophisticated international coalition that had been operating under their noses for months. "Why haven't you reported this through normal channels?" Morrison asked. "Why maintain your cover instead of alerting base security immediately?" Maria's smile was grim. "Because normal channels have been compromised. Not completely, but enough to make traditional reporting protocols dangerous. 3 separate attempts to communicate intelligence about this operation through standard military networks resulted in immediate changes to the hostile surveillance pattern, suggesting that someone with access to classified communications has been providing real-time intelligence to the opposing force." Rodriguez and Chun exchanged glances that conveyed years of shared experience in situations where trust became a luxury they couldn't afford. "So you've been conducting a solo counterintelligence operation for 3 months, Morrison said. "Gathering evidence, tracking hostile agents, and preparing countermeasures without backup or official support." "Not entirely solo," Maria corrected. "I've had support from my parent organization, but the operational security requirements meant that even my handlers weren't aware of the full scope of what I was discovering. The compartmentalization was necessary to prevent the kind of compromise that has obviously affected other communication channels." She gathered the photographs and documents into organized stacks, each representing a different aspect of the threat they were facing. "The reason I'm revealing all of this now is because the situation has reached a critical point. Based on intercepts from the past 72 hours, the hostile operation is moving into its final phase. They're not gathering intelligence anymore. They're positioning assets for action." Morrison felt the familiar weight of command responsibility settling on his shoulders, but this was unlike anything he had faced in 15 years of military service. The enemy wasn't in some distant country where rules of engagement were clear and objectives were defined. The enemy was already inside. The Wire had been studying them for months, and was preparing to strike at a time and place of their choosing. "What kind of timeline are we looking at?" Morrison asked. Maria checked her watch, a gesture that suddenly seemed far more ominous than it should have. "Based on communication patterns and logistical indicators, I estimate we have between 48 and 96 hours before they initiate whatever operation they've been planning." "And what exactly do you think they're planning?" Maria walked to a wall map of the base and began pointing to specific locations, each marked with small symbols that Morrison now realized had been there for months, camouflaged as routine maintenance markers. "Primary target appears to be the Advanced Training Facility, specifically during the graduation ceremony for SEAL Class 334 scheduled for Friday. Secondary targets include the Communication Center, the Armory, and what appears to be a planned extraction point near the harbor. The graduation ceremony." Morrison's blood ran cold as he realized what Maria was describing. Friday's ceremony would bring together not just the graduating SEAL class, but their families, high-ranking military officials, and potentially even Pentagon leadership. It would be the perfect target for an operation designed to inflict maximum casualties and psychological damage. "They're not just planning sabotage," Morrison said, the pieces finally clicking into place. "They're planning a terrorist attack disguised as espionage," Maria nodded grimly. "And they've been using my 18-month security assessment to identify exactly how to penetrate our defenses when it matters most." The weight of the revelation settled over the room like a suffocating blanket. Morrison found himself calculating timelines, resources, and response options while simultaneously grappling with the realization that his base had been under systematic attack for months without anyone except Maria being aware of it. "We need to contact Colonel Martinez immediately," Rodriguez said, reaching for his secure phone. "No," Maria said sharply, her tone carrying an authority that made all three SEALs pause. "That's exactly what we cannot do, at least not through normal channels." She pulled out another file, this one containing communication intercepts and technical analysis that painted an even more disturbing picture of their situation. "Remember what I said about compromised communication channels? The leak isn't coming from lower-level personnel or casual security breaches. Based on the timing and specificity of intelligence that's been passed to the hostile operation, compromise exists at or near command level." Morrison felt his world shift again. The idea that someone in the upper echelons of base command might be working with foreign intelligence services was almost impossible to process. But the evidence Maria was presenting suggested exactly that scenario. "You're talking about treason," Chun said quietly. "You're suggesting that someone with high-level access has been feeding information to a hostile operation." "I'm suggesting that the evidence points in that direction," Maria corrected. "Whether it's willing cooperation, unwitting manipulation, or technical compromise of secure systems, the result is the same. Traditional reporting channels are not secure." She spread out a timeline that showed the correlation between official communications and changes in hostile surveillance patterns. The relationship was undeniable every time sensitive information was transmitted through standard military networks. The opposing force adjusted their operations within hours. "So what do you propose?" Morrison asked. "We can't just sit on intelligence about a pending attack on American military personnel." Maria's expression shifted into what Morrison recognized as operational planning mode, the focused intensity of someone accustomed to making decisions in situations where failure meant death. "We handle this the way special operations are supposed to be handled," Maria said. "Small team, minimal communications, direct action based on superior intelligence and tactical surprise." She began sketching out what appeared to be a comprehensive operational plan on a whiteboard that Morrison hadn't noticed before, but which had obviously been prepared for exactly this kind of briefing. The hostile operation is built around their assumption that we're unaware of their presence and capabilities. They've been operating with impunity for months, gathering intelligence and positioning assets based on the belief that their security is intact. Maria drew symbols representing known hostile personnel positions, infiltration routes, and what appeared to be planned attack vectors. But they don't know that I've been tracking them just as carefully as they've been surveilling US. I know their operational patterns, their communication schedules, their personnel assignments, and most importantly, their planned timeline. Rodriguez studied the tactical display with growing appreciation. You're proposing a preemptive strike. I'm proposing that we turn their operation against them, Maria corrected. They've spent months learning our weaknesses and planning to exploit them. But in the process, they've revealed their own vulnerabilities and created opportunities for US to neutralize their threat before they can act. The plan Maria outlined was elegant in its simplicity and devastating in its potential effectiveness. Rather than trying to alert higher command through potentially compromised channels, they would use their small team's superior intelligence to systematically dismantle the hostile operation from within. The key advantage we have is time, Maria explained. They don't know that their security has been compromised. They're still operating under the assumption that their presence is undetected and their communications are secure. That gives us a window of opportunity to act before they realize they've been discovered. Morrison found himself being drawn into the tactical planning despite his reservations about operating outside the chain of command. The plan Maria was describing had the kind of surgical precision that appealed to his SEL training, but it also represented a level of risk that could end all of their careers if it went wrong. What about backup? Chen asked. If we're operating without official support and something goes wrong, we're on our own. Maria's smile was grim but confident. We won't be entirely on our own. My parent organization has assets in place that can provide limited support if needed. But you're right, that this operation carries significant personal and professional risk for all of us. She turned from the whiteboard to face the three SEALs directly. I want to be clear about what I'm asking. This isn't an order, and it's not an official mission. I'm asking you to trust my assessment of the threat and my plan for neutralizing it based on nothing more than the evidence I've shown you and your own professional judgment. Morrison studied the tactical plan, weighing the risks against the potential consequences of an action. If Maria was right about the pending attack, then doing nothing could result in casualties that would make the base a target for years to come. But if Maria was wrong, or if her intelligence was somehow flawed, then they could be initiating an action that would be perceived as aggression against potentially innocent civilians. How certain are you about the intelligence? Morrison asked. What's your confidence level in the assessment that we're facing an imminent attack? Maria didn't hesitate. 97% certain based on communication intercepts, surveillance patterns, and logistical indicators. The remaining 3% uncertainty comes from the possibility that they might accelerate or delay their timeline based on factors I haven't been able to monitor. And the plan to neutralize the threat? 85% probability of success with minimal collateral damage, assuming we maintain operational security and execute within the planned timeline. Rodriguez looked at Morrison and Chun, reading the same calculation in their expressions that he was running in his own mind. These were the kind of odds that SEAL teams lived with on every mission, but rarely with stakes this high and with so little official support. If we do this, Morrison said slowly, we're committing to see it through to completion. There won't be any opportunity to change our minds or hand it off to someone else once we start. Maria nodded. That's correct. Once we initiate, we're committed to full execution. The room fell silent as each person contemplated the decision they were being asked to make. Morrison looked at Rodriguez and Chun, seeing his own internal struggle reflected in their faces. These were men who had built their careers on following orders, respecting the chain of command, and operating within established protocols. What Maria was proposing represented a complete departure from everything they had been trained to do. But they were also men who had sworn an oath to protect American lives, and that oath sometimes required decisions that couldn't wait for official approval or bureaucratic process. What's the first step? Morrison asked, his question serving as acceptance of the mission parameters. Maria moved to her desk and began pulling out equipment that Morrison now realized had been carefully positioned for exactly this moment. Maps, photographs, communication devices, and what appeared to be weapons that definitely weren't standard issue for civilian contractors. Phase 1 involves confirming the current positions and status of all known hostile assets, Maria explained, spreading out a detailed surveillance report. I've been tracking their movements and communication patterns, but we need real-time intelligence before we can initiate any direct action. She handed each of the SEALs a folder containing detailed profiles of the individuals they would be targeting. There are 7 confirmed hostile operatives currently active in the area. 3 are conducting electronic surveillance from positions off base. 2 are maintaining physical surveillance of key facilities. 1 is serving as a communication relay, and 1 appears to be the operational commander coordinating the overall mission. Rodriguez studied the photographs and profiles with professional interest. These are quality operators. Military training, probably special forces background, definitely experienced in covert operations. Agreed, Maria replied. Which is why our approach needs to be equally professional. We're not dealing with amateur terrorists or casual intelligence gatherers. These are skilled operatives working for sophisticated intelligence services. She pulled out a timeline that showed the planned sequence of operations for the next 48 hours. Tonight we conduct final reconnaissance and confirm targeting data. Tomorrow morning, we begin systematic neutralization of their surveillance network. Tomorrow evening, we eliminate their operational capabilities entirely. Friday morning, we're in position to provide security for the graduation ceremony while simultaneously mopping up any remaining elements of their operation. Chun looked up from the tactical plan he had been studying. This is a lot of moving parts for a 4-person team operating without official support. Which is why timing and coordination are critical, Maria agreed. Each phase depends on the successful completion of the previous phase, and any significant deviation from the timeline could compromise the entire operation. Morrison was running calculations in his head, weighing resources against objectives and considering contingencies for various failure modes. What happens if we're discovered during the reconnaissance phase? What if one of the hostile operatives realizes they're being watched? Maria's response was immediate and confident. Escalation protocols. If our presence is detected during any phase of the operation, we accelerate the timeline and move directly to neutralization. The element of surprise is our primary tactical advantage, but operational flexibility is our backup plan. She walked to a wall safe that Morrison hadn't noticed before and began removing equipment that made it clear this conversation had moved well beyond theoretical planning. Body armor, communication equipment, specialized weapons, surveillance gear, and extraction resources, Maria said, distributing equipment with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times before. Everything you need to operate effectively against professional opposition. Rodriguez examined the communication equipment with growing appreciation. Military grade, encrypted, probably untraceable through standard monitoring systems. Correct. These units operate on frequencies and protocols that aren't accessible through normal military networks. For the duration of this operation, we're essentially invisible to both friendly and hostile electronic surveillance. Morrison was beginning to understand the full scope of what Maria had been preparing for during her 18 months at the base. This wasn't just a security assessment that had accidentally discovered a hostile operation. This was a carefully planned counterintelligence operation that had been building toward exactly this moment. "How long have you known this was coming?" Morrison asked. "How long have you been preparing for this specific scenario?" Maria paused in her equipment distribution, and for the first time since revealing her true identity, she looked almost uncertain. The specific threat? About 3 months. But the possibility of something like this? That's been part of my mission. Parameters since I arrived. Naval Base Coronado trains the most elite warriors in the American military. It was always a potential target for hostile intelligence services. She resumed organizing equipment, but her tone had become more reflective. What I didn't expect was the level of sophistication and international coordination. This isn't just one country trying to steal SEAL training secrets. This is a coordinated effort by multiple intelligence services to conduct what amounts to a direct attack on American military capability. Morrison checked his watch and realized that they had been talking for over 2 hours. Outside, the normal rhythms of base life continued. SEALs training, personnel going about their duties, families preparing for Friday's graduation ceremony. None of them aware that their security depended on decisions being made in a cramped maintenance office by 4 people operating outside official channels. "Once we start this," Morrison said, "there's no guarantee we'll be able to maintain secrecy about what we're doing. Other personnel are going to notice unusual activity, and we may be forced to bring additional people into the operation." Maria nodded. "That's a calculated risk. But the alternative is allowing a coordinated attack to proceed against a facility full of American military personnel and their families. I'd rather risk exposure than risk those casualties." Rodriguez stood up and began examining the body armor Maria had provided. "How soon do we start?" Maria checked her own watch and looked at each of the SEALs in turn. "Reconnaissance begins in 4 hours. Final briefing in 2 hours. After that, we're committed to operational tempo until the threat is neutralized." The weight of what they were about to undertake settled over the room like a physical presence. In less than 6 hours, they would begin an operation that could either save dozens of lives or end their careers in disgrace. But as Morrison looked at his teammates and considered the evidence Maria had presented, he realized that the choice had already been made. Sometimes being a warrior meant making decisions that couldn't wait for official approval. The next 4 hours passed in a blur of preparation and final intelligence gathering. Maria had transformed her maintenance office into what amounted to a tactical operations center, with communication equipment, surveillance monitors, and tactical displays that revealed the true scope of the operation she had been conducting. Morrison found himself impressed despite his reservations about operating outside official channels. Maria had been building toward this moment for months, creating contingency plans, positioning resources, and developing the kind of detailed intelligence picture that would normally require an entire team of analysts and support personnel. "Final positions confirmed," Maria reported, indicating locations on a detailed map of the base and surrounding area. "All 7 hostile operatives are maintaining their established patterns. No indication that they're aware of any change in their operational security." Rodriguez was monitoring communication intercepts through equipment that looked like it belonged in a spy movie rather than a maintenance office. Electronic chatter remains consistent with previous patterns. They're still operating under the assumption that their presence is undetected. Chun had been reviewing the tactical plan for the 3rd time that evening, looking for weaknesses or contingencies they might have overlooked. "Timeline looks solid, assuming we can maintain coordination without traditional communication support." Morrison felt the familiar pre-mission tension that had preceded every significant operation of his career, but amplified by the knowledge that they were operating without official sanction or backup. If something went wrong, they would be facing not just operational failure, but potential court-martial and the end of their military careers. But they were also people who had sworn an oath to protect American lives, and that oath sometimes required decisions that couldn't wait for bureaucratic approval. Phase 1 initiates in 30 minutes, Maria announced, her tone shifting into the clipped precision of operational command. Rodriguez and Chun take positions Alpha and Bravo for surveillance confirmation. Morrison and I handle positions Charlie and Delta. Radio check every 15 minutes, coded communication only. The 4 operatives began final equipment checks with the methodical thoroughness that had been drilled into them through years of training. Body armor, weapons, communication gear, night vision equipment, and the specialized surveillance tools that would allow them to track their targets without being detected. As they prepared to leave the maintenance office, Morrison realized that Maria had removed every trace of her 18-month cover identity. The cluttered desk, the maintenance manuals, even the thick glasses had been replaced by the operational equipment and professional demeanor of an elite intelligence operative. What happens to Maria Thompson after this is over? Morrison asked. Maria smiled grimly. Maria Thompson disappears. Hopefully, she gets to retire quietly after completing one final mission. If not, she shrugged with the casual acceptance of someone accustomed to uncertain outcomes. They left the base separately, using different routes and timing their departures to avoid creating any pattern that might alert hostile surveillance. Morrison found himself moving through familiar territory with completely different awareness, seeing potential threats and surveillance positions that he had never noticed during 18 months of routine base operations. The reconnaissance phase proceeded exactly as Maria had predicted. All 7 hostile operatives were confirmed in their expected positions, maintaining surveillance patterns that suggested they were unaware of any change in their security situation. Communication intercepts indicated they were proceeding with plans for operations scheduled to begin the following evening. All assets confirmed, Rodriguez reported through their encrypted communication system. No indication of counter-surveillance awareness. Phase 2 is go, Maria responded. Initiate neutralization sequence according to planned timeline. What followed was a masterclass in small unit tactics applied to counterintelligence operations. Using techniques perfected through years of combat operations, the 4-person team systematically dismantled a sophisticated espionage network that had taken months to establish. The electronic surveillance positions were neutralized first, with specialized equipment that rendered their monitoring systems useless, while making the failures appear to be routine technical problems. The physical surveillance operatives were identified, tracked, and ultimately detained through methods that would ensure they couldn't warn their colleagues or resume their activities. By dawn Friday morning, the hostile operation had been completely disrupted without any of the operatives realizing that their mission had been compromised by a coordinated counterintelligence effort. But Maria had saved the most important target for last. The operational commander is still active, she reported as they reconvened at the maintenance office. Based on communication intercepts, he's aware that his surveillance network has experienced technical difficulties, but he doesn't appear to realize that his operation has been systematically dismantled. Morrison checked his watch. The graduation ceremony was scheduled to begin in 6 hours, with families and high-ranking officials already beginning to arrive at the base. What's your assessment of his likely response? Morrison asked. Maria consulted her intelligence reports one final time. Based on his communication patterns and operational history, I believe he'll attempt to proceed with the original attack plan, possibly with modifications to account for the loss of his surveillance capabilities. So we're not done yet? No, Maria replied grimly. We've eliminated his support network and disrupted his intelligence capabilities, but the primary threat is still active. He's going to make one final attempt to complete his mission, and he's going to do it today. Morrison looked at his teammates, seeing the same determination in their faces that had carried them through countless missions in hostile territory. They had come too far and risked too much to stop now. Then we finish this, Morrison said simply. As they prepared for the final phase of their operation, Maria pulled Morrison aside. "Commander, I want you to know that regardless of how this ends, working with you and your team has been an honor. You've proven that the reputation of Naval Base Coronado's personnel is well-deserved." Morrison clasped Maria's shoulder. "The fee? Honor has been ours. Now let's go protect some American warriors and their families." The graduation ceremony would proceed as scheduled, but it would be defended by 4 people operating in the shadows, ensuring that America's newest Navy SEALs could celebrate their achievement without knowing how close they had come to tragedy. The graduation ceremony for SEAL Class 334 began at precisely 1400 hours under a brilliant California sun that seemed to mock the tension radiating through the 4-person security team positioned around the ceremony grounds. To the hundreds of family members, friends, and military officials in attendance, it appeared to be a perfect day for celebrating the achievement of America's newest elite warriors. But Maria, Morrison, Rodriguez, and Chun knew better. Somewhere in the crowd or positioned around the perimeter, a highly trained operative was preparing to turn this celebration into a tragedy that would reverberate through the military community for years to come. Maria had positioned herself in the maintenance area adjacent to the ceremony grounds, officially there to ensure that sound systems and electrical equipment functioned properly throughout the event. Her coveralls were back in place, her thick glasses perched on her nose, but the woman wearing them was no longer the bumbling contractor who had stumbled through 18 months of seemingly incompetent repairs. Through her carefully concealed communication system, she maintained contact with the 3 SEALs, who had taken positions that provided overlapping fields of observation across the entire ceremony area. Alpha position, clear sight lines to main platform and first 3 rows of seating. Rodriguez reported from his position disguised as additional ceremony security. Bravo position, monitoring approaches from the harbor side and vehicle access points. Chun confirmed from his location near the parking area. Charlie position, observation coverage of administrative buildings and elevated positions. Morrison added from his concealment point that provided tactical oversight of the entire operational area. Maria had been monitoring communication intercepts throughout the morning, tracking the electronic signature of their remaining target as he moved through the area conducting final reconnaissance for his planned attack. The pattern was consistent with someone preparing for immediate action, but the specific timing and method remained unclear. Delta position, confirming all surveillance equipment active and communication intercepts ongoing. Maria reported, her voice carrying the steady calm of someone accustomed to high-stakes operations. The ceremony proceeded through its initial phases with military precision. Admiral Catherine Walsh, commander of Naval Special Warfare Command, delivered opening remarks that highlighted the extraordinary dedication and sacrifice required to earn the SEAL Trident. Families beamed with pride as their sons, and in this class's case, their daughter prepared to officially join the ranks of America's most elite fighting force. But beneath the patriotic celebration, Maria was tracking electronic signals that indicated their target was moving into position for whatever action he had planned. Electronic signature moving toward the main platform area, Maria reported quietly. Signal strength increasing, suggesting close proximity to ceremony grounds. Morrison felt his pulse increase as the tactical situation developed. They had successfully neutralized the support network, but the primary threat was still active, and apparently determined to complete his mission despite the loss of his surveillance capabilities. Visual contact? Morrison queried through their encrypted communication system. Negative visual contact, but electronic signature suggests positioning within 50 meters of the main platform. Maria replied, her voice tight with concentration. As she monitored multiple data streams simultaneously, Rodriguez scanned the crowd more intensively, looking for anything that seemed out of place among the sea of military families and official guests. But their target had demonstrated months of sophisticated tradecraft, and blending into a crowd of this size would be well within his capabilities. Then Chun's voice crackled through their communications with the kind of urgency that made everyone's blood run cold. Charlie position, I have possible visual contact. Individual matching target profile, moving toward the stage area carrying what appears to be a maintenance equipment case. Approaching from the East Service entrance. Maria felt pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. A maintenance worker with legitimate access to the ceremony area, carrying equipment that could conceal weapons or explosives, approaching. The main platform where America's senior military leadership was seated just meters away from the graduating SEAL class. Confirm identification, Morrison commanded, his voice carrying the authority of someone taking tactical control of a rapidly developing situation. Negative confirmation, but movement pattern and equipment profile consistent with target parameters. Chun responded. Individual is wearing maintenance coveralls similar to base standard, but equipment case is not standard issue for this type of event. Maria was already moving, abandoning her fixed position and beginning to maneuver toward the intercept point that would allow her to confront their target before he could reach the main platform. Delta moving to intercept, Maria reported. All positions maintain observation and be prepared for immediate escalation. As Maria moved through the crowd, her mind was running through tactical calculations at lightning speed. If their target was indeed carrying weapons or explosives, then any confrontation could result in exactly the kind of violence and chaos that the original attack was designed to create. But allowing him to reach the platform area could result in casualties that would make confrontation seem like the preferable option. The maintenance worker Shun had identified was now clearly visible to Maria, and the sight confirmed her worst fears. The individual was indeed carrying equipment that could easily conceal weapons, moving with the purposeful determination of someone executing a planned operation, and his approach vector would bring him within striking distance of the ceremonies. Most important participants. But what made Maria's blood run cold was the recognition that flashed through her mind as she got her first clear look at the target's face. This wasn't just any hostile operative. This was someone Maria recognized from intelligence briefings. Someone whose reputation for ruthless efficiency had made him a priority target for counterintelligence services worldwide. Alexei Volkov, former Spetsnaz, currently freelance operative specializing in high-profile assassination and sabotage operations. If Volkov was the operational commander for this mission, then the threat level was far higher than any of them had anticipated. Target confirmed as priority hostile, Maria transmitted, her voice carrying a new level of urgency. Escalate to immediate neutralization protocols. The graduation ceremony continued around them, with Admiral Walsh presenting individual awards to graduating SEALs, while their families applauded and took photographs. None of them aware that just meters away, a confrontation was developing that would determine whether this celebration ended in triumph or tragedy. Maria moved through the crowd with the fluid precision of a predator closing on her prey. But Alexei Volkov was no ordinary target. As Maria approached within 20 meters, she saw Volkov's posture shift, almost imperceptibly. The subtle change in stance that indicated a professional operative had detected surveillance and was preparing to respond. The next few seconds unfolded with the deadly ballet of two elite operators recognizing each other across a crowd of innocent civilians. Volkov's hand moved toward his equipment case while his eyes locked onto Maria with the kind of recognition that suggested this confrontation had become personal rather than merely professional. Target has made surveillance, Maria transmitted, her voice barely audible as she continued her approach. He knows we're here. Morrison's response was immediate and decisive. All positions converge on target location. Civilian safety is priority 1. Target neutralization is priority 2. But Volkov wasn't planning to be taken quietly. In one fluid motion, he abandoned any pretense of being a maintenance worker and began moving toward the main platform with the determined efficiency of someone executing a mission that he knew might be his last. The equipment case fell open as he moved, revealing not weapons or explosives, but something far more sophisticated and dangerous, a military-grade jamming device designed to disrupt all electronic communications within a half-mile radius, and what appeared to be a chemical dispersal system that could turn the graduation ceremony into a mass casualty event. "Chemical weapon," Maria transmitted urgently. "Repeat, target is carrying chemical dispersal device. All personnel avoid respiratory exposure and prepare for mass casualty protocols." Rodriguez was moving through the crowd from the opposite direction. But the press of ceremony attendees made rapid movement, impossible without creating the kind of disturbance that could trigger panic among hundreds of family members. Shun had abandoned his concealed position and was sprinting toward the platform area, but his approach vector would bring him into contact with Volkov. Several seconds after the hostile operative reached his apparent objective, Morrison was calculating tactical options while moving toward an overwatch position that would allow him to provide support for his team members, who were now engaged in close proximity confrontation with a professional killer. But Maria was closest to Volkov, and as the Russian operative began activating his chemical dispersal system, Maria realized that conventional tactics weren't going to prevent the attack that was now only seconds away from execution. So Maria Thompson, the clumsy maintenance worker who had spent 18 months being invisible, made a choice that would make her unforgettable. She charged directly toward Volkov through the crowd, abandoning all pretense of stealth or tactical advantage. Shouting at the top of her lungs in a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed under extreme circumstances, "Chemical attack, everybody down. Cover your faces and move away from the platform." The effect was immediate and dramatic. Military families who had been enjoying a peaceful ceremony suddenly found themselves responding to emergency commands shouted by someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. Training kicked in for the military personnel in attendance, and what could have been panic became organized evacuation as people began moving away from the platform area while covering their faces. Volkov realized that his operational security had been completely compromised and that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Rather than attempting to complete his original mission, he shifted to what appeared to be a contingency plan designed to cause maximum casualties. Even if he couldn't reach his primary target, he activated the chemical dispersal system while simultaneously triggering the electronic jamming device, creating a dual threat that could kill dozens of people while preventing any coordinated response from base security or emergency services. But Maria had anticipated exactly this scenario, and her months of preparation included countermeasures that Volkov couldn't have expected. As the chemical dispersal system began releasing its deadly payload, Maria activated a device she had concealed in her coveralls, military-grade neutralization system that she had positioned throughout the ceremony area. During her months of maintenance work, the device created an instantaneous chemical reaction that rendered Volkov's weapon harmless, turning what should have been a lethal cloud into nothing more than harmless vapor. But the electronic jamming system was still active, cutting off all communication and making coordinated response impossible. That's when Maria made her second critical decision. Instead of trying to disable the jamming device through technical means, she chose the most direct approach possible. She tackled Alexei Volkov with the full force of 18 months of suppressed aggression and professional determination. Two operatives went down in a tangle of limbs and equipment, crashing into the platform area where America's senior military leadership had been seated just moments before. But this wasn't the clumsy collision of an incompetent maintenance worker. This was the controlled violence of an elite operator neutralizing a deadly threat. Volkov was skilled, experienced, and desperate, But Maria had advantages that the Russian operative couldn't overcome. 18 months of studying the base layout, positioning equipment, and preparing for exactly this confrontation. Home field advantage in an environment that Maria knew better than anyone alive. The fight lasted less than 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds contained enough violence and technical skill to convince anyone watching that Maria Thompson had never been the bumbling contractor she appeared to be. When it was over, Alexei Volkov lay unconscious and secured with restraints that Maria had somehow produced from her coveralls. While the electronic jamming device had been reduced to sparking wreckage, Morrison, Rodriguez, and Chun arrived at the platform to find Maria standing over their neutralized target. Breathing heavily but uninjured, her coveralls torn and her glasses hanging at an odd angle, but her expression carrying the quiet satisfaction of someone who had just completed a mission that had taken 18 months to execute. Threat neutralized. Maria reported through communication systems that were suddenly working again. All civilians safe, no casualties, chemical weapon neutralized, electronic warfare capabilities destroyed. The graduation ceremony area was in controlled chaos as military personnel and base security worked to evacuate families and secure the area. But there were no injuries, no panic-related casualties, and no indication that anyone other than the four-person team understood what had actually just occurred. Admiral Walsh approached the group with the purposeful stride of someone accustomed to taking charge in crisis situations. "Gentlemen, and ma'am," she said, her voice carrying the authority of her rank but also a note of profound respect, "I think we need to have a very serious conversation about what just happened here." Maria straightened her glasses and attempted to smooth down her disheveled coveralls, but there was no hiding the fact that the mild-mannered maintenance worker had just single-handedly prevented what could have been one of the worst attacks on American military personnel in recent history. "Ma'am," Maria replied, her voice carrying traces of the accent and authority that she had concealed for 18 months. "I believe that conversation will need to involve people with significantly higher security clearances than anyone currently present." 3 weeks later, Naval Base Coronado had returned to its normal rhythm of training exercises, operational briefings, and the daily routine of preparing America's most elite warriors for missions around the world. But for those who knew what to look for, there were subtle changes that indicated the base's security posture had been fundamentally upgraded. New personnel had appeared in key positions. Electronic surveillance systems had been quietly enhanced, and access protocols had been tightened in ways that most base personnel attributed to routine security updates rather than responses to a specific threat that had been neutralized just meters from where they worked and trained. Lieutenant Commander Morrison was in his office reviewing training schedules when Master Chief Rodriguez knocked on his door with an expression that suggested important news. "Come in, Chief. What's the word?" Rodriguez closed the door behind him and took a seat across from Morrison's desk. "I just got word from Colonel Martinez. The investigation into the Volkov incident has been completed and classified at levels that officially make it invisible to normal military records." Morrison wasn't surprised. The implications of what they had discovered and prevented were too significant for normal bureaucratic processing. "What about Maria?" "That's the interesting part," Rodriguez replied, pulling out a folder that bore classification markings Morrison had never seen before. "Turns out Maria Thompson really was just a cover identity, but the real story is even more impressive than we thought." He opened the folder to reveal a personnel file that painted a picture of operational service that spanned multiple decades and dozens of countries. The woman they had known as a clumsy maintenance worker had actually been one of the military's most decorated undercover operatives, with a record of successful missions that read like something from a spy novel. Her real name is classified, but her operational designation is Blackbird. And according to this file, she's been conducting deep cover security assessments for over 20 years. Naval Base Coronado was just her most recent assignment. Morrison studied the file, seeing commendations from organizations he had never heard of, and mission records that were so heavily redacted they were barely readable. But the pattern was clear. This was someone who had dedicated her career to protecting American military installations by finding their vulnerabilities before hostile forces could exploit them. What happens to her now? Rodriguez smiled. That's where it gets really interesting. Apparently, her performance during the Coronado assessment was so exemplary that she's been offered a promotion to operational command level. She'd be training the next generation of deep cover security specialists, so no more maintenance coveralls? Not unless she chooses them for tactical reasons, Rodriguez replied. But I have a feeling we'll be seeing operators trained by Maria Thompson showing up at bases around the world, looking perfectly ordinary while they conduct the most sophisticated security operations in military history. Morrison closed the file and leaned back in his chair, still processing the realization that their clumsy contractor had been one of the most elite operatives in the American intelligence community. What about us? Any repercussions for operating outside the chain of command? Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. Officially, we were responding to intelligence provided by an authorized security assessment team. Unofficially, our willingness to act on limited information and trust Maria's judgment has been noted. At levels that could significantly impact our future career opportunities. Good impact or bad impact. The kind of impact that results in opportunities to work on operations that don't officially exist. Rodriguez replied carefully, the kind of assignments that people like Maria Thompson have been handling for the past 20 years. Morrison understood the implication. Their performance during the Volkov incident had demonstrated capabilities and judgment that qualified them for the shadow world of deep cover operations and classified missions that operated outside normal military channels. It was an honor, but also a responsibility that would fundamentally change their careers and their lives. Have you spoken to Chun about this? He's already accepted reassignment to a classified operational unit. Apparently, his technical skills and ability to operate under pressure made him an ideal candidate for electronic warfare operations. Morrison nodded, feeling a mixture of pride and melancholy at the realization that their team was being dispersed to assignments that would probably prevent them from working together again. What about you, Chief? Rodriguez smiled. I've been offered command of a training program for advanced security operations. Apparently, there's a need for instructors who understand the difference between theoretical security and operational reality. Morrison understood that he was being offered similar opportunities, chances to work at levels of the military that most officers never knew existed. But it also meant leaving behind the direct leadership of SEAL teams that had defined his career up to this point. Any regrets about getting involved in Maria's operation? Rodriguez considered the question carefully. We prevented what could have been the worst attack on American military personnel in decades. We protected the families of graduating SEALs, and probably saved the base from becoming a target for future attacks. The only regret I have is that most people will never know how close we came to disaster. Morrison stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the training areas where new classes of SEALs were preparing for their own careers of service and sacrifice. Maybe that's how it should be, he said finally. Maybe the best victories are the ones that prevent tragedies rather than responding to them. 3 months later, Naval Base Coronado received a new maintenance contractor, a mild-mannered woman in her 30s who seemed to have trouble with even the simplest repairs. She flooded a barracks during her first week, locked herself in a supply closet during her second week, and caused a brief power outage during her third week. The SEALs called her Butterfingers, and most of them barely noticed her as she went about her work with apparent incompetence and invisible dedication. But Lieutenant Commander Morrison, now serving in a classified position that didn't officially exist, sometimes wondered what tattoo she might be hiding beneath her ill-fitting coveralls. and what operations she might be preparing for during her long months of appearing perfectly ordinary, because he had learned that sometimes the most important battles are fought by people no one ever notices, and sometimes the greatest heroes are the ones whose names never appear in history books. The maintenance worker with the mysterious tattoo had taught him that appearances can be deadly deceiving, and that America's safety sometimes depends on warriors who are content to remain invisible, fighting battles that officially never happened to protect people who will never know how close they came to danger. And in a world where threats could come from anywhere at any time, that kind of invisible protection was more valuable than all the recognition and glory that traditional warfare could provide. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.